The rehearsal dinner was set in the private dining room of the premier country club in the county, a space filled with polished mahogany, crystal chandeliers, and 60 guests wearing tailored suits and designer dresses. I was 34 years old, sitting beside my fiancé at the head table, wearing a simple navy dress I had bought off the rack. Across the white tablecloth sat my future mother-in-law, a woman who looked at me with the cool precision of an inspector looking for a flaw. The waiter had barely finished pouring the champagne when she picked up a thick white folder, slid it across the table until it rested against my wine glass, and said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear that I should sign it because I was a gold digger who brought nothing to this family. I did not flinch, and I did not look at my fiancé, who had suddenly lost all the color in his face. Instead, I picked up the pen sitting beside the paper, turned the document over, and read every single line while the room slowly went silent. They all leaned in, watching me with that quiet, eager satisfaction people get when they think a story is reaching its obvious conclusion. They thought I was trapped, a woman with a small business and an empty background being put in her place by old money. What they did not know was that the folder sitting in front of me was not the only document in the room that night. What I did next, with that pen already in my hand, and why my future father-in-law at the far end of the table nearly came out of his chair, is the part none of them ever saw coming. To understand why I held that pen without shaking, you have to go back 12 years to a rusted pickup truck, a pair of worn leatherwork gloves, and everything I had spent my entire life learning to hide. I own a commercial landscaping and snow removal company called Slater Grounds. When I started, it was just me, a second-hand mower, and a cell phone I answered in parking lots. Today, it is a fleet of 40 trucks, 90 employees, and state contracts across 3 counties. When a blizzard hits at 3 in the morning, my crews are the ones clearing the highway medians and hospital parking lots so ambulances can get through. That business made me a very wealthy woman, though you would never guess it by looking at me. I still drive a dented 2009 pickup, I wear flannel shirts, and my hands are rough because I still get out and work when a job runs late. Money, to me, was always something you earned through hard labor and kept quiet about. I learned early on that as soon as people discover what you have, their demeanor changes. The math starts in their eyes, the subtle favors follow, and genuine relationships disappear. So I got very comfortable letting people assume I had nothing, using my silence as armor to keep from getting hurt. That armor came from my grandmother, the woman who raised me in a small rented duplex after my parents left. She spent 30 years cleaning houses for wealthy families, but she never let anyone make her feel small. She owned a pair of thick leather gloves, soft and cracked from years of pulling weeds and handling tools, and she carried them everywhere. She used to tell me that a person's true worth is never handed to them on a silver platter, but built with their own hands where no one can take it away. When she passed, those gloves were the only thing she left me, and I have kept them in my truck's glove box for every major milestone of my life. I met my fiancé, Thomas, in a school parking lot at 6 in the morning during an 8-inch snowstorm. He was a high school history teacher who had come out early to help shovel walkways, doing it entirely wrong and risking his back. I showed him how to throw the snow properly, and we ended up talking in the freezing air for 20 minutes while my crew finished the lot. He didn't ask what I made or what kind of lifestyle I lived. He asked what books I liked to read and listened with genuine curiosity. For the first time in years, I felt like I could relax, so I gave him my number, believing I had finally found a man who cared about who I was rather than what I had. 2 years later, I began to understand the world he came from. The Vance family name was stamped across the town library and hanging on dusty portraits in the local historical society. They represented old money and local prestige, the kind of family that received automatic respect and reserved tables without trying. Thomas had quietly distanced himself from that world, taking a modest teaching job that his family considered beneath him. When he was with me, he seemed relieved, like someone stepping out of a uniform he hated wearing. He once told me that there was nothing more exhausting than a family trying to maintain a reputation long after the substance behind it was gone. The first time I met his mother, Catherine Vance, was at their family lake house, an impressive estate that looked grand from a distance but showed subtle signs of neglect up close. Catherine met me at the door wearing polished pearls and a smile that felt entirely artificial. She looked at my simple coat, asked if I did garden work for a living, and corrected my grammar before I could even finish a sentence. At dinner, his sister asked about my family with the clinical tone of someone filling out a form, and when I mentioned my grandmother had passed, she simply let an uncomfortable silence fill the room. I sat at that dinner with a thriving multimillion-dollar company under my name, but I said nothing to correct them. I let them believe I was just a girl with a small truck and an unstable job, stepping quietly to avoid causing friction. Thomas held my hand under the table, clearly proud of how polite I was being, while I swallowed my pride. Looking back, I was repeating an old pattern, making myself smaller just so I would be accepted into a family structure I had never known growing up. I wanted to belong to something permanent, so I endured the cold looks and condescending comments, believing that patience would eventually win them over. When Thomas proposed on our anniversary with a modest ring he had saved up for months to buy, I did not think about his mother's coldness. I thought about building a future with a good man and finally having a real family. I said yes immediately, imagining holiday dinners and a life where I was finally included. But as soon as we announced the engagement, Catherine took control of the entire planning process, moving the event to their exclusive country club and curating a guest list of prominent locals. When I asked about inviting my key crew members who had been with me for a decade, she dismissed the idea, stating space was far too limited for casual acquaintances. What followed over the next few months were constant, quiet tests designed to remind me of my place. At dinners, Catherine would correct which utensil I used or rephrase my sentences in front of guests to make them sound more polished. His sister made backhanded compliments about my wardrobe, treating every detail of my life like an amusing budget project. It was done so subtly that if I brought it up to Thomas, it sounded like I was being overly sensitive. He would sigh, tell me his mother was just set in her ways, and ask me to keep the peace for his sake, so I kept shrinking to fit their expectations. One evening at the lake house, I accidentally overheard Catherine speaking in the study while looking for the restroom. She was talking to his sister, her voice sharp and firm, calling me an opportunist who was clearly after what was left of the family fortune. Standing in that dark hallway, those 3 words, after what's left, stuck in my mind. It was a strange phrase to use for a family that projected absolute wealth, suggesting a drain rather than abundance. I walked back to the dining room in silence, realized the dynamic was far more complicated than it appeared, and decided it was time to quietly look into things. The following week, I arranged a meeting with my corporate attorney to review my estate plans and assets. She pointed out that my business was worth 8 figures and that entering a marriage without legal safeguards was an unnecessary risk. Together, we drafted a comprehensive legal document that kept my company, real estate holdings, and liquid assets completely separate and protected under my sole ownership. I put the signed paperwork in a leather folder, placed it in my office safe, and kept quiet about it. I was not trying to start a conflict. I simply wanted to ensure that the enterprise I built from nothing remained secure no matter what happened. A month later, while visiting the Vance estate, I accidentally pushed open the wrong door and found myself in Catherine's private office. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, but there were distinct pale rectangles where large, valuable paintings had clearly been removed. On the desk lay a stack of unpaid bills marked with urgent red stamps, alongside bank notices indicating severe liquidity issues. Touching the leatherwork gloves I always kept in my jacket pocket, the reality finally clicked into place. They were not looking down on me because I was poor. They were projecting their own financial desperation onto me, using me as a distraction to conceal their failing estate. Knowing the truth changed how I viewed every sharp comment and arrogant gesture from Catherine. I realized her rigid focus on status was an act born out of fear, a desperate attempt to preserve an image that was falling apart behind closed doors. I actually felt a brief moment of sympathy for her, recognizing how exhausting it must be to maintain such an elaborate lie. Yet, I still loved Thomas, and he knew nothing about the true state of his family's finances. I chose to stay silent, holding on to the hope that once the wedding was over, we could step away from the drama and build our own simple life together. That hope vanished completely at the rehearsal dinner when Catherine slid that legal document across the table in front of 60 prominent guests. It was an aggressive prenuptial agreement, drafted to strip me of any claim to the Vance name or family property while publicly framing me as a financial threat. She sat back, folded her hands, and let the room sink into an uncomfortable silence as she announced that a sensible woman in my position should sign immediately. Thomas sat frozen beside me, looking at his mother and then down at his plate, entirely unable to stand up for me in the moment I needed him most. I looked at Thomas, waiting for him to speak, but the silence stretched on until I finally accepted who he really was when under pressure. Slowly, I opened my small handbag, pulled out my own leather binder, the one containing my attorney's certified financial disclosures and asset protection agreements, and placed it neatly beside her document. I uncapped my pen, looked Catherine directly in the eyes, and signed my own name across the bottom line of my document with complete composure. Then, I slid my thick financial ledger and asset summary directly across the white tablecloth to Thomas's father, who opened it with a faint frown. As his father turned the pages, reading the audited valuations of Slater Grounds, the bank balances, and the commercial real estate portfolio owned entirely by me, his hands began to shake. The color drained completely from his face, and he nearly pushed his chair back as he realized that the quiet woman sitting across from them possessed more liquid wealth than their entire family legacy combined. The dining room was dead silent as Catherine stared at her husband in utter confusion, completely unaware of what he was reading. I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and picked up my bag, feeling a sense of absolute clarity for the first time in 2 years. I turned to Thomas, gave him a quiet look of genuine farewell, and thanked Catherine for finally making things perfectly clear to everyone in the room. I walked out of that country club into the crisp night air, walked over to my dented pickup truck, and opened the glove box to touch my grandmother's old leather gloves. Sitting in the driver's seat, I realized that true worth is never defined by a family title or the approval of people living in an empty shell. I turned the key, drove away into the dark, and never looked back.